My name is Tom Harris, and I've been working in radio for over 20 years. I've repaired equipment in remote locations, climbed towers in storms, and spent entire nights listening to the sound of static. But nothing prepared me for what I found at Tower 22. I got a call from a small community radio studio in rural Oregon. They were picking up a mysterious transmission coming from a radio tower that had been abandoned for over 2 decades. It was impossible. Tower 22 had no power and was not connected to any working transmitter. The studio technician sent me an audio file. It was a recording that started with static, and then a female voice whispered, "Help us! Please, help us!" In the background there were footsteps and what sounded like a low moan. There was something unsettling about the sound, but I decided to dismiss it as just another technical job. A glitch, maybe a pirate radio. I grabbed my tools and drove over. The road was desolate, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow the evening light. The GPS stopped working about 10 kilometers away, and the sky began to close in with dark clouds. When I finally spotted the tower, it looked like a giant skeleton in the middle of the vegetation. Its red lights blinked intermittently, something that shouldn't happen without power. I stopped the car and got out, feeling the cold, heavy air around me. Next to the tower was a small concrete building, the old transmission building. I grabbed my flashlight and went inside. The interior was in ruins, control panels covered in dust, cables hanging from the ceiling, and a smell of rust mixed with mold. However, what made me most uncomfortable was the sound. A tape recorder, which shouldn't have been working, emitted static interspersed with fragmented words. "Please. You're late." I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. My name wasn't on the recording, but the feeling that someone was talking to me was undeniable. I picked up the recorder, but it stopped as soon as I touched it. The silence in the room was deafening. I continued my inspection and found an old diary in a partially opened drawer. The pages were yellowed, and the last few entries seemed rushed, as if the person writing them was afraid. One sentence was underlined several times. "Don't talk to them. Don't listen." My breathing became heavy. Something was very wrong here. I decided to climb the tower to check the transmission cables. Maybe there was some kind of interference that explained the transmission, but deep down, I knew I was trying to find a logical solution to something that didn't make sense. As I climbed the metal ladder, I heard footsteps in the building below. They were slow and rhythmic, as if someone was walking on the concrete floor. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I kept climbing, but the sound of the footsteps now seemed to follow me. When I reached the top, the wind howled around me, and the lights on the tower flickered erratically. I grabbed my tool and checked the connectors. They were all disconnected. There was no power. There was no way the tower could be transmitting. Then the radio on my belt began to hiss. "Tom! Tom! Can you hear us?" My hands shook, almost dropping the tool. The voice was female, the same as on the recording. But there was something different. It was clearer, as if it were close by, speaking directly into my ear. "Who are you? What's going on here?" I asked, trying to remain calm. The answer came in a cold tone, full of desperation. "You're late. He's coming." The radio turned off by itself. I looked down and saw something that made my heart stop. At the top of the tower, on the platform opposite me, there was a figure standing completely still. I couldn't see her face, but she seemed to be watching me. I ran down the tower as fast as I could, nearly tripping on the steps. When I entered the building again, I noticed that the tape recorder was working again, emitting a low, distorted laugh. I grabbed the diary and ran to my car. When I tried to start the engine, the radio on the dashboard tuned itself to the same frequency. "Help us, Tom. Help us." Whatever it was, Tower 22 wasn't going to let me off the hook that easily. The car radio kept playing the same phrase. "Help us, Tom. Help us." My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine again. Nothing happened. It was as if Tower 22 was draining all the energy around it, including mine. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car. The air was colder, almost biting, and the darkness seemed thicker. The flashing lights of the tower called to me, more and more mesmerizing. I heard the footsteps in the building behind me again, but now they seemed to echo from all sides. "Who's there? Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice reverberating in the void. No answer, just the sound of static that seemed to be coming from the sky itself. I walked back to the building, the diary clutched in my hand like a shield against whatever was happening. I flipped through the last few pages again, trying to find some clue. One name appeared several times: Henry Clark, the former tower operator. He described similar events, with voices coming over the radio, unexplained lights, and the feeling of being watched. One of the last entries read, "The tower draws us in. It wants more of us. I've tried to escape, but it always finds a way to bring me back." As I read, I heard the female voice again, this time clear and close. "You can't leave, Tom." I looked up and saw something that made my mind reel. In the reflection of a blank monitor, a group of figures stood behind me, motionless, watching me. I turned quickly, but the space was empty. I walked over to the transmitter in the center of the room. The lights were flashing wildly, and the sound of voices grew louder, filling the room. I recognized some of them: Henry's voice, the female voice, and, to my horror, my own. "This isn't real. It isn't real," I repeated to myself as I tried to turn off the equipment. Each button I pressed seemed to bring more voices. They were screaming now, desperately, as if they were fighting to escape from somewhere. It was then that I saw a button labeled System Reboot. Without thinking, I pressed it. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The static stopped, the lights went out, and the air felt less heavy. I thought I had succeeded. But then, the room began to shake. The walls cracked, and a black light began to emanate from the transmitter like a living shadow. The darkness spread quickly, swallowing everything around it. Before I could react, I heard a guttural laugh, which seemed to come from inside my own mind. "You can't turn off what's always been on." I ran out of the building, but the landscape had changed. The sky was completely dark, without stars or moon, and the tower seemed larger, almost infinite. In place of the road, there was an empty field covered in mist. On the horizon, I saw figures walking toward me. They had no faces, but they moved in perfect synchrony, their bodies floating lightly above the ground. The radio in my pocket began to hiss again. I reached for it, hesitantly, and heard my own voice. "You're late. He's coming." That's when I realized the voice wasn't just on the radio. It was in my head. The figures moved closer, forming a circle around me. Their bodies began to writhe, their arms reaching out like liquid shadows, slowly enveloping me. I struggled. I screamed, but it was useless. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the tower, shining brightly, like a beacon to something beyond this world. I woke up at the base of the tower with the sun rising on the horizon. Everything was quiet. The building was empty, and the transmitter seemed completely turned off. I struggled to my feet, trying to make sense of what had happened. My car was there intact, with the engine running. I drove back to the city, but something was wrong. People stared at me as if they didn't recognize me. When I went to the radio studio to report what had happened, I realized that there was no recording of the broadcast. To them, Tower 22 had never been active. As they spoke, I glanced at my reflection in a window and saw something that made my blood run cold. The faceless figure was behind me just for a moment before disappearing. The radio in the studio began to crackle, and a familiar voice echoed, "Help us, Tom. You're late." My name is Jake Thompson, and I've always thought my adventurous spirit would lead me to incredible stories to tell. But sometimes, curiosity can drag us to places we can never completely escape. That's what happened the summer I decided to explore the Black Swamp in Louisiana. I was traveling with my friends: Amy Carter, my childhood adventure partner; Eddie Blake, the funny one of the group, always ready to challenge fear; and Lila Montgomery, who had a keen sense of danger but never stopped following us. Our trip had been planned to be relaxing, but everything changed when we walked into a roadside bar where we heard the first stories about the swamp. "Are you guys going to the Black Swamp?" the bartender asked with a low, ironic laugh. He was a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes that seemed to observe more than speak. "Yes, we're thinking of exploring. Is there anything interesting there?" I asked, ignoring Lila's cautious look. If you think it's interesting to never go back, then go ahead. They say there's a ghost ship there, and when you hear the music, it's gone. It calls to you." Amy snorted, and Eddie laughed, raising his beer glass. "Ghost ships, Jake? Sounds perfect for your collection of idiotic stories." Lila, however, looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should reconsider. Places like this usually have a reason to be avoided." But the decision had been made. The next morning we rented a small boat and set off toward the swamp. The Black Swamp lived up to its name. The dark water reflected the tall, twisted trees around it, covered in moss that hung like ghostly curtains. The air was heavy, humid, and thick, with the constant sound of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. Mist crept across the surface of the water, creating the sensation that we were floating in the middle of a dream. Amy paddled along calmly, while Eddie fiddled with his camera, taking pictures of what he described as the scariest place on earth. Lila kept her eyes on the shore, as if waiting for something to emerge from the vegetation. "Have you guys noticed how quiet it is?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. That was when I heard it for the first time. It was a faint sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakably human. A slow, melancholy melody, as if someone were playing an old harmonium. The music seemed to echo from somewhere far away, but at the same time, close enough to make us uneasy. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around. "Hear what?" Eddie answered, but Amy frowned. "It sounds like music." Lila squeezed my arm, her expression now filled with dread. "Jake, I think we should go back, now." But the sound was drawing me in, as if the swamp itself were calling to me. I followed the melody, rowing faster, despite Lila and Amy's protests. The music grew louder, clearer. It was mesmerizing, a combination of notes that stirred something deep and primal within me. That's when we saw it, a drifting boat, slowly moving toward us. It was a small boat, made of dark wood with cracked sides and signs of old age. There was no one visible on board, but the music seemed to be coming from within. The sound was louder now, almost oppressive, filling the air around us. Eddie reached for the camera but stopped mid-swim, his expression changing from comical to something close to panic. "There's someone there. I swear I saw someone." Amy tried to row in the opposite direction, but no matter how hard we tried, the drifting boat kept coming closer, as if it were being guided by an invisible force. "This isn't normal. It isn't normal," Lila cried, her eyes filling with tears. When the boat finally stopped a few feet away from us, the sound abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening. It was then that something began to emerge from the shadows on the deck. A skeletal figure wearing a worn sailor's hat. He didn't move, but he seemed to be staring straight at me. My heart raced as I realized the boat was waiting. It had come to pick us up. The silence that followed the music's cessation was absolute. The marsh seemed to hold its breath, and the figure in the boat remained still, like a statue, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the space around us. The fog had closed in, hiding everything beyond a few feet of the boat. We were isolated, alone. "Row, now!" I shouted, trying to sound in control, but my voice was shaking. Amy and Eddie grabbed the oars, but no matter how hard they struggled, the boat wouldn't move. The black waters around us felt thick, as if something invisible was holding us back. "It's pulling us in," Lila whispered, staring at the figure. Her eyes were fixed on her as if hypnotized. It was then that the music began again. It no longer came from the ghostly boat, but from the waters around us, each note reverberating through the marsh. The figure finally moved, tilting its head slightly to the side, like a predator examining its prey. With a slow, deliberate movement, he raised a skeletal hand and pointed at us. The water began to bubble around our boat. The bubbles erupted with strange sounds like muffled laughter and distant moans. Eddie, usually the most playful of the group, was in a panic, rowing frantically. "This isn't real, this isn't real," he shouted over and over. But it was real. The water began to change, transforming into something that seemed alive. I saw pale hands emerge, long, thin fingers reaching for the edge of the boat. Amy screamed as one of them nearly grabbed her. "Don't look at the water. Stay in the boat," I ordered, holding the oar like a weapon. But Lila stood still, muttering something to herself. Her eyes were fixed on the ghost boat, where the figure now stood, holding something that looked like an ancient instrument, like a harmonium. The music grew louder, more intense, and Lila began to stand up. "Lila, no!" I screamed, grabbing her arm, but she was stronger than I expected. She turned to me, and her eyes were now pale, empty, as if her soul had been drained. With a quick movement, she let go and jumped into the water. I saw pale hands holding her, pulling her into the depths as she disappeared without a sound. Amy was crying uncontrollably, and Eddie continued to row in panic, even though it was useless. The ghost boat was now beside us, and the figure pointed again, this time at Eddie. Before I could stop him, he let go of the oars and stood up as if in a trance. "Eddie, don't do it," I screamed, but he didn't respond. He stepped into the ghost boat without hesitation. As soon as his feet touched the deck, the music stopped again. Eddie looked back one last time, tears streaming down his face, and then the boat began to move away, disappearing into the mist. Now it was just me and Amy, floating in the oppressive emptiness of the swamp. The water was calm again, but the silence was more frightening than any sound. I looked over at Amy, who was huddled in the bottom of the boat, holding her knees. "We're getting out of here. It doesn't matter how, but we're getting out." I grabbed the oars and began rowing with all my strength. The fog seemed to move with me, resisting me, but I kept going. Every muscle in my body burned, but fear kept me going. Amy looked up at me, her eyes filled with dread and hope. "Jake, please don't stop. Just don't stop." The music started again, this time more distant, as if it were watching us go. I looked back one last time and saw the skeletal figure still standing in the boat, motionless, just watching. But something told me it wasn't over. After what felt like hours, we finally emerged from the fog. The trees around us began to look more familiar, and the water lost its oppressive black hue. A small dock appeared in the distance, and I forced myself to keep going until I reached it. Amy and I collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping in shock. The music had faded, and the swamp was suddenly too calm. I stood up and looked back. The fog still hung, but the ghost boat was gone. When we got back to town, we tried to tell them what had happened, but no one believed us. The locals said there had never been a black swamp, and no one remembered Eddie or Lila. Even the photos Eddie had taken were gone from the camera. It was as if they had never existed. But I knew the truth. Every night, when the silence of dawn takes over, I hear the same soft, hypnotic melody echoing in the distance. I know the boat is still there, waiting, and that one day it will come back to me. My name is Evan Williams, and I can safely say that I never should have accepted that challenge. I've always been the kind of guy who wanted to impress others, especially my friends. But that night at Pinewood Cemetery, I learned that there are things that shouldn't be challenged, and there are places that should never be visited. It all started as a Halloween prank. We were gathered on the old hiking trail that led to the cemetery. Me, Josh, Megan, and Tyler. Josh, as always, was the ringleader, the kind of guy who turned any conversation into a challenge that was impossible to ignore. "So, Evan, are you really going to play tough? Or are you scared of a few whispers?" Josh teased, laughing as he shone his flashlight in my face. "I'm not scared. It's just a cemetery, Josh. Nothing but rocks and dirt," I replied, trying to sound confident, but my voice was shaking a little. Megan looked at me with concern. She always had a sixth sense for these things, and she seemed uncomfortable from the start. "Maybe we shouldn't do this. Pinewood has a dark history. You've heard the legends, Evan. People hear their names whispered and they just disappear." Legends to scare children? Nothing more. I tried to dismiss her fear, but the truth was that her words bothered me. Tyler, who was chewing on a piece of candy, shrugged. "If he wants to go, let him go. Just remember to scream if the ghosts come, okay, champ?" When we reached the cemetery gates, a chill ran down my spine. They were rusted and covered in moss, and the trees around them cast long, twisting shadows in the moonlight. The wind blew hard, making the dry leaves on the ground rustle as if they were alive. Josh opened the gates with a loud creak and pointed inside. 30 minutes, Evan. Show me you've got guts, and I'll never call you a wimp again." I looked at my friends' faces, hesitating. Megan looked like she was going to cry. Tyler was laughing, but it sounded forced. Josh just smiled, confident that I wouldn't have the courage. "I'll prove it. You'll see," I said, crossing the gates. The cemetery was more terrifying than I had imagined. The tombstones were tilted, covered in moss, and so old that many of them had illegible inscriptions. The air was thick, cold, and filled with an oppressive silence. Every step I took seemed to echo as if something were following me. I walked for a few minutes, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, but then I heard it for the first time. "Evan." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The sound was soft, almost indistinct, but it was my name. I looked around, but there was no one there. Maybe it was the wind, I tried to convince myself. I kept walking, but the sound came back, this time clearer. "Evan, come to us." My stomach churned. The whispers seemed to be coming from multiple directions, echoing between the graves. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, but all I saw were shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The shadows didn't answer, but something in the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and a strange smell like wet earth and wilted flowers filled my nostrils. When I looked at a nearby headstone, I saw that the name on it had changed. It now read, Evan Williams. My knees nearly gave out. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look at another headstone. The name on it was mine too. And another. It was as if the entire cemetery was screaming that I shouldn't be here. I walked back to the entrance, trying to ignore the whispers that now seemed to be laughing at me. When I reached the gates, they were closed, even though no one had stayed to lock them. I pushed at them, but they didn't budge. "Josh, Tyler, Megan, get me out of here," I screamed, but the sound of my voice seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. It was then that I felt something behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I turned slowly and saw a tall, slender shadow among the tombstones, motionless but definitely watching me. Who are you?" I asked. But there was no answer. The shadow began to move, gliding toward me without making a sound. I ran away, tripping over graves and falling to the ground. When I looked back, it was still coming, slow but inevitable. I knew I had to get out of there. But how? Whispers now filled the air around me. They came from every direction, repeating my name in mocking, sadistic tones. I ran aimlessly, dodging tombstones and thorny bushes, while the shadows seemed to grow, stretching across the ground like claws trying to reach me. My flashlight trembled in my hand, and every time I looked back, the figure was closer. "Evan, come to us." The sound was clearer now, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. I stopped running, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, I realized that I had stopped in front of an ancient tomb, larger than the others, with an inscription that seemed newly carved. "Here lies Evan Williams." My body froze. The date of birth was correct. The date of death was today. "This can't be real. It can't be real," I screamed, but the echo of my voice seemed to mock me. I tried to move away, but the gravestones around me began to change. They now bore familiar names. Josh, Megan, Tyler, each had the same date of death. I screamed for my friends, but the only sound was the whispers, louder and closer now. The cemetery felt alive, taking shape around me. The trees leaned forward like giant hands, and shadows danced across the ground in a frantic pattern. My legs felt heavy, as if the ground were trying to pull me down. That was when I heard a scream. "Megan." I looked around, trying to locate the direction. I ran toward it, but the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever. I found a path that led to a ruined chapel in the center of the place. The door was ajar, and inside, I saw something that made my heart stop. Megan was kneeling before an altar covered in candles, surrounded by shadows that seemed to whisper in her ears. She was still, but her eyes were open, glassy, as if in a trance. Beside her, I saw Josh and Tyler in the same position. "Megan, Josh, Tyler, wake up." I ran to them, but as soon as I got close, the shadows turned on me. The shadows had faces now, but they were distorted, pale, with empty eyes and mouths twisted into terrible smiles. They whispered words I didn't understand, but each sound felt like a direct blow to my mind. I felt my vision blur as I tried to pull Megan away from the altar. "Get out! You don't belong here!" I screamed, but the only answer was a low, echoing laugh. The shadows closed in, and I felt invisible hands grabbing my arms and legs. I was pulled to the ground, my body sinking into the cold, damp earth. I fought with all my might, but it felt like the cemetery itself was alive, determined to consume me. That was when I saw the figure again, the tall, slender shadow that had been chasing me since the beginning. It loomed over me, its eyes glowing like white flames. She leaned in close, and her voice finally spoke clearly. "You belong to us now." I felt the earth rise up to my chest, cold and suffocating. My strength began to fade. As I sank, I saw Josh, Megan, and Tyler rise from the altar. Their eyes were blank, and their movements were clumsy, like puppets controlled by something invisible. "No, this can't be happening," I screamed, but my voice sounded weak and distant. I woke up on the ground in the cemetery with the sun rising over the horizon. The fog had cleared, and the place looked normal. I struggled to my feet, expecting to see Josh, Megan, and Tyler, but they were nowhere to be seen. I ran to the gate and found their car parked, empty. I looked around, calling out their names, but there was no response. I went to the local police station, trying to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The officers looked at me skeptically, saying that no one named Josh, Megan, or Tyler had ever been there. Even their houses were empty, as if they had never existed. A few weeks later, I began to hear the whispers again. They weren't coming from the cemetery this time. They were coming from my own house, in the walls, in the hallways, in the darkness of my bedroom at night. And then one day, I found a tombstone in my front yard. On it was my name, with the same inscription: "Here lies Evan Williams. You will never escape Pinewood."